Well, hello, welcome to Walking the Talk, the sermon podcast of Creekside Community Church in San Leandro, California, where we help you live out what we talked about on Sunday. My name is Jeff Bruce. I'm a pastor here. I'm joined by Max Butler. He's a worship pastor here. In fact, he's the worship pastor here.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, officially.
And then also joined by another man, my old friend, John Bruce, my dad.
Emphasis on old.
Also a pastor here.
How old is he?
Dad, how are you?
I'm good.
How was your vacation?
Oh, other than fighting the raccoons in our garden, I'm fine. They've been assaulting all the plants we planted, so we're a little discouraged.
So that's a literal fight, not a metaphorical fight.
Yeah, well, they're winning right now because they come at night when we're asleep, and we'll go out and all the plants are dug up. And I don't know why they do this. They're criminals. They're nature's criminals.
Dude, they are the demon rodent.
They
Man.
are.
They're the raccoon. I can't stand raccoons.
Oh.
I have some hot takes on raccoons, man. I do not like them.
Trash bandits? What's wrong with
Trash bandits. That's right. Yeah. We learned nothing from Guardians of the Galaxy. Good. Well, we're not going to talk about movies or raccoons. We're going to talk about the Bible. But maybe they'll intersect, guys. Maybe we can.
Yeah, it often happens.
It often happens.
In our perverse minds.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to recap two sermons, one on Luke 8:40 through 56, one on Luke 9:1 through 17. So we're going to look at the end of Luke 8 to start and the stories of the woman with the issue of blood and Jairus' daughter. So I will start in verse 40. Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him, and there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James, and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her. But he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called her, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. Two stories, two women, both illustrate faith and the nature of faith. What stands out to you, Dad, about this passage?
I've always identified with Jairus because I tend to get in a hurry and just feel like, oh, got to make it happen now. It's got to happen now. And I can kind of see him coming to Jesus almost as a last resort as his daughter is dying. And it just wants to get him to his house so he'll get there in time. And obviously God has a different plan, and yet it all works out fine. And that's what strikes me about this. And then the other thing is that the woman is really an issue of time, too. She's been, on the other hand, laid up with this disease for years and years and years, and nobody's been able to help her. And yet Jesus is able to help her. But it's interesting. Why do you think that he makes her go public here? Because she wanted to just do this on the sly and nobody know about it or anything like that. And yet he stops the whole process. And I'm sure Jairus is jumping from one foot to the other. Come on, we got to get there. And just has this conversation with her. Why do you think he does that?
What do you think, Max?
Well, I mean, in your talk, I mean, you brought it up. Jesus wants us to proclaim the things that he's done. It's not enough just to do the thing and have a private moment with it, but to glorify God, you need to tell it, to share it, that people will see God. It will be an encouragement for one thing, and it makes your faith public.
Yeah.
Reminds me of the story of the 10 lepers in Luke 17, where only one returns and thanks him.
Yeah.
And Jesus says that one's faith saved him.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense that the other 9 who go away, they just wanted to get something from Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But the one who returns is actually grateful to the giver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of faith, is that you see the one who has given you this gift,
Yeah.
and appreciate and honor him and do so publicly. And I
Yeah.
think that's really at the core of what faith is. It's faith in God and who he is. It's
Yeah.
glorifying God and his character, not just getting things. Because
Yes.
everyone in this story wants something from Jesus, right? When Jesus gets back from the Gentile country across the Sea of Galilee, they all told him to get out of there, but now he comes back and everybody wants a piece of him. Everybody wants a part of him. Everyone's touching him.
Yeah.
But I think what Luke is keying in on is that that's not faith.
Yeah.
It's not faith just to want things from Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's to embrace what Jesus wants for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's
you
good.
see that thread with both the woman with the issue of blood and with Jairus.
Yeah.
They both have to learn that lesson.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because the other side of it is there are times when Jesus asks people not to say anything.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Like at the end of this chapter.
yeah. So there's a contrast right there.
Yeah. So why do you think he charges them to tell no one? Why does he say stay private with this versus go public with this?
The only difference I can see is the last time he said it, he was in a Gentile region.
Yeah.
And so he tells the man who was previously demon possessed, that he cast the demons out of, who went into the swine and all that. He says, go back to your people and tell them what great things God has done for you.
Right.
And so he goes back and tells everybody. But I think in this situation, I think Jesus doesn't want everybody in Israel to know that he's raising the dead, because he will never do anything else but raise dead people. And so I think he's just trying, it's basic to me, it's just crowd control.
Yeah. I think that's part of it, and that's certainly true in the other instances. One detail here that's interesting is the people who are at this funeral ridicule him.
Yeah, yeah,
So he says, she's not dead, she's sleeping. And rather than ask, well, what do you mean, teacher? Or what are you saying? They just mock him.
yeah,
And so they don't take his words seriously.
yeah,
And it's interesting, Jesus doesn't let them see what he's about to do. He only takes the people who are following him, the mother, the father, and these 3 disciples in this instance. They get to see the greater revelation of his power.
right, right.
But those who don't take Jesus at his word don't get to see his activity and
Yeah.
his power.
Yeah,
Because they're just looking for what they can get from Jesus. They don't really care about what Jesus has to say.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Like seeing they do not see and hearing they do not understand. It's that type of mentality where unless you actually have faith, you won't be able to experience what Jesus does fully.
And it's a contrast you see throughout the Gospels. And I think it's very relevant because it's very tempting to say, until I see more, I can't believe more. I can't have more faith.
Yeah,
And Jesus would say in the Gospels, until you take me at my word and obey, you won't see.
yeah, yeah,
You're not going to get to this point where you're just overwhelmed by evidence and then believe.
yeah,
You have to at some point say, the evidence is enough for me to take a step and obey. And then is when you see God show up and act.
yeah. Blessed are those who do not see and believe.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, too, as you guys were talking about the woman, I thought of the verse Paul says, he says, I believed, therefore I spoke. And one of the evidences of true belief is you can't keep it to yourself. You're going to tell other people about it. And I think Jesus, that's why he stops to validate this woman's faith and have her go public with it. And I think the same is applicable for us. If you can take God's blessings but never tell anybody about it, then you have to question whether your faith is real,
Yeah.
even though you're being blessed.
Yeah.
But I want to have a private faith. I don't talk to other people about it. Well, I'm not sure a private faith is a valid faith.
Well, it ties into what Jesus will go on to say in chapter 9 when he talks about being ashamed of me.
Yeah, Yeah.
and I will be ashamed of him at my return. And
Yeah.
just that there has to be some public identification with Christ
Yeah.
for genuine faith
Yeah.
to be evidenced, which is why the first thing we do as Christians is get baptized. That's how you come to follow Jesus in the New Testament. It's a public identification. There's no private public distinction.
Yeah.
Who you are toward the world is who you are inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like what
That's
you
good.
said in your talk, though. You said you don't beat people over the head with Jesus. And I think that one way that people can do that is they sound as if they are bragging about how good God has been to them, meaning that they're almost glorifying themselves, by saying how, well, I'm blessed,
Right.
just talking about, and there's a fine line because, sometimes it's genuine and people are just talking and praising God, but then other time you can kind of get this sense that people are trying to imply that because of who they are and because of what they've done, that Jesus has shown them particular favor, and that, that's kind of one of the, something I've noticed I've heard people testify, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you have a public faith that isn't obnoxious?
Yeah.
I know there are people like that. I don't think that's common.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the norm in the Bay Area.
I think that if we have anything that we're tempted by is to keep our heads down and keep quiet.
Yeah.
And not be identified with Jesus.
Yeah.
And so I think faith, for most people to go public in any way with their faith is a pretty clear sign that they believe.
Yeah.
Because you're not motivated by emotion. You're not motivated by, it's just basically, well, this is part of being a disciple. I need to identify myself with him.
Yeah. If anything, it'd probably be more in social media where your bragging tends to be more of the, the lingua de franc.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's more like broadcasting.
Yeah.
I would say living publicly as a Christian just means you have an integrated identity in Christ.
Yeah.
If this is the most important thing about you, it permeates your life.
Yeah.
And if you feel like you can't talk about it authentically in public, well, then go back to how do you commune with God in private?
Yeah.
How do you see him work in your life? And if you're coming up short there, well, then you really need to deepen your own walk with the Lord, because one thing I've often said, the best way to get the good news out of you is to get the good news into you. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not tasting and seeing that the Lord is good, it is going to feel more artificial and more phony to talk about God in public and more performative than natural. At the same time, though, I would say the only way it becomes natural is by embracing how unnatural it's going to feel at the beginning.
Yeah.
And unnatural at the beginning might just say, hey, that's a hard thing you're going through. I'm going to make a point to pray for you. I just wanted to let you know that. And then going back and say, hey, I was praying about that. How did that go? Like that does not come across phony, but it identifies you as the kind of person who expects God to act and do things, right? Or, when you share about your weekend saying, yeah, man, we had a church service. It was great. We talked about this. It was really encouraging to me. And just talk about it like this is a normal part of your life and an important part.
Well, the interesting thing about praying for people is it shows that you expect God to do something, but it also puts you in this vulnerable position of God not doing something exactly the way they might want it, you might want it, and you have to, as you said in your talk, learn how to wait, learn how to stretch your faith, and learn how to dwell with a no and learn how to be persistent. And that again, that's another way you can share with somebody, I know this didn't work out, but I'm praying for you still. And, staying persistent.
I'd like to transition because I think the point you brought up at the beginning is good. And this ties into what you just said, Max. There seems to be an antithesis between hurriedness and faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a point you made earlier. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just when I start to hurry, feel like I've got to do something now, and I neglect every other situation. I get kind of panicked and stuff like that. I know I'm not walking by faith because I'm not trusting that God is in control of the clock, that God does what he wants to do. And that to me is a clear indication of unbelief in my own life.
Right.
When I get hurt, he who hurries with his feet sins, is what Proverbs says.
Yeah.
And so that's, I kind of see that here. But there are times when I think, well, I do. I can't speak for anybody else, but I just feel like, oh, I'm doomed. I'm late. I've got to. This has got to get done. Or what are we going to do here? Stuff like that. Rather than trusting, no, fret not. It tends only to evil. Is the idea. One thing I noticed here too is that Jesus is a good example of giving voice to his faith, because when he's with those people, he says she's not dead. She's only asleep when she's clearly dead. and yet she is only asleep.
Right, because
really,
he's going to transform death.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's faith. But he's going to be doing this by faith in his Father, because he doesn't do anything in his own power. He doesn't. So it's really a step of faith for him to say that even. But he gives voice to his faith because he believes that God's going to work, which he does, and raises her from the dead.
I think it's a good check for us in a culture that's just obsessed with productivity, and productivity meaning efficiency, just getting the most possible things done.
Yeah.
That you can't live by faith and live by that kind of productivity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because essentially what you have faith in is what's urgent. That the most important thing for me to do at any moment is what feels most urgent to me, what feels most pressing. And I find that I can never live by my priorities and live by the tyranny of the urgent.
Right.
That even if things feel urgent, they're never the most important thing to do.
Yeah.
The most important things to do are what God calls me to do every day, do these things. And the urgent things, I trust, I'll get to some of them, I won't get to some of them.
Yeah.
And I just think in following Jesus, that's a lesson you've got to learn, because the urgent will rarely be the most important.
Yeah. 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 The issue is not, does this need to be done? The issue is, does this need to be done by me? Is this what God has given me to do in this situation, and I need to step up and do it, or do I need to trust that He's going to get it done one way or the other if I can't stay calm and walk in the path that I believe He's called me to walk in?
Yep.
Yeah, it also brings more glory to God and less glory to you if something doesn't happen on your timetable, because you want you want the people to think, wow, he's efficient, or he's productive, and it's more about you presenting yourself to be more godlike as opposed to actually letting God do what He's supposed to do in His time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be a means of self-justification.
Yeah.
Good. Well, let's move on to the next passage here. Luke 9, 1 through 17. Verse 1. And He called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And He sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And He said to them, take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics. And whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And wherever they do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them. And they departed and went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening, and he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had arisen. Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he sought to see him. On their return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them, and spoke to them of the kingdom of God, and cured those who had need of healing. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came and said to him, send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place. But he said to them, you give them something to eat. They said, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people, for there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. And they did so, and had them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So Jesus sends out the 12 to do ministry, sends them with nothing, and then later they've got basically nothing and have to feed a bunch of people.
Yeah.
So a lot of great lessons about dependence here.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. This is a much bigger moment in the other Gospels. There's a lot more stuff in Matthew and Mark about Jesus sending out the 12 and all the instructions he gave them. And Luke just emphasizes one thing: don't take anything.
Yeah.
It's just you're going to, and I like that because it's just, he kind of got down to the essence that I'm sending you out with nothing. And you're going to have to depend on other people to feed you, to take care of you, which is going to give you inroads into their lives and be able to talk to. It's really a counterintuitive way to send people who are already scared to death to go out and do what he's been doing. And by the way, don't take anything, and just trust that it'll be supplied. And it worked, because years later, probably 2 years later, just before the cross, Jesus said, "Now, when I sent you out with nothing, did you lack anything?" And they said, "No, nothing." Remember that lesson, because you're going to need that in the future here.
Yeah. It strikes me too that it makes them dependent on other people.
Yeah.
And they're trusting that God will provide for them through other people.
Right.
And there's an interesting principle there, I think, for being on mission. And it's Sam Chan brings this up in a book we read together years ago about evangelism. But he says that you have to make yourself vulnerable to the yet to believe to foster relationships with them.
Yeah.
And so it can't just be about, look at all that I can give. Look how I can serve. Look what I can do for you. But like, hey, could you help me with this thing in the yard? Or, hey, I have a question, about the neighborhood. I need help answering it. Or, you have to, it's okay to ask for help as well.
Yeah.
Because what it shows is that you have some trust in them, or that you're reaching out, you're trying to engage. And it's actually a great bridge for relationship as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a good lesson to learn. It's just a humbling lesson to learn.
It is. Now, I remember in Hudson Taylor's journal, which is incredibly long. But anyway, when he was in China, all the missionaries lived in the European enclave. And they had, they ate European food, they dressed like Europeans, and then they would go out into the community and preach the gospel. And then they would go back to the safety of their little European society there. And they were accomplishing nothing. The Chinese didn't trust them. They didn't know them. They didn't trust them. So Hudson Taylor, when he got there, he dressed like a Chinese. He wore Chinese clothes. He went out and got an apartment in the slums of the city and stuff like that, and learned to speak Chinese. And they began that, which was the beginning of China Inland Mission. They were accomplishing things that nobody else was accomplished, simply because he was making himself vulnerable to them and having to depend on them and things like that. So he's just following Jesus.
Yeah,
That's
coming as a servant.
Yeah, coming as a servant, yeah.
I think I'm going to say I think a lot of churches in U.S. today, because of their...
Just name them, Max.
No, I mean, there's just so many they're so resource rich. Yeah, I mean, there's so much money, and I think they'll go into most situations thinking, oh, we have so much to bring, whether it's financial aid, whether it's administrative aid, whether it's just wisdom. I mean, there is great wisdom that we have in the Word, but at the same time, we're so stacked, and we come in there with such pride in a certain way to a lot of situations. And I think I've found myself tempted to think, okay, when I'm thinking about witnessing or even just ministering to people, I am always thinking that I'm bringing something great. And the thing that we found in prison ministry, when we were doing a lot of prison ministries, we always got more back in terms of, I always felt like we were hardly doing anything. We were just showing up, and then we were humbled by how they worshipped there, how gracious they were. It was interesting, and I think that's one of the things. When you're in ministry, you're going to find that when you you realize you have nothing, that it's a way that God will provide for you in a lot of ways.
Spurgeon has this great quote where he says something like, "The church in my day is too rich, too smart, too powerful to do much."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
And his point was exactly what you're saying, that when we're resource rich, it's very easy to think, well, if we just get the funding in the right places, the training in the right places, and we deploy in the right places, then we're going to conquer. We can do this. And it teaches exactly the opposite lesson of what Jesus is teaching here.
Yeah.
Now, I'm all about funding. I'm all about training. I'm all about deploying. The trap comes when we think it's going to be easy because we did that, or that there's any situation we can go into where we're not desperately dependent on Jesus to show up, or we fall flat on our face and fail.
Yeah.
And I think that's the lesson for especially the church in the West to embrace, for me to embrace, is that I have nothing apart from Christ to give people. And unless Christ works, there's no amount of wisdom, intelligence, money, resources that can win people to the kingdom.
Yeah.
Unless you're actually giving Christ too, because that's the thing, is that you can set up great programs in there. I'm convicted of this a lot of times too, even with my music programs, that if I'm actually not sharing the gospel or sharing Christ with these people, I mean, there's a ministry of presence, but at the same time, if the word doesn't come in, if you don't actually share the gospel with them,
Right.
then you're not truly ministering.
That's what we have to offer.
Yeah.
I remember reading about a pastor who had a big church and wealthy church, and visiting missionary came, and he said to him, "Well, we can't say like Peter any longer, silver and gold have we none." And the missionary says, "No, and we can't say in the name of Jesus walk either."
Yeah. Yeah. So what does that mean for practically walking in dependence moment by moment? What does that look like? Because that seems to be the overriding lesson Jesus is trying to teach here. Take no bread, rely on other people. And then if you fast forward to the 5,000, they still have no bread, essentially. And they haven't learned the lesson that the Lord will provide. The Lord will work through us to give people what they need.
Yeah.
So it seems like the point of the passage is, it is Jesus at work through you. And so you need a mindset of dependence to see God do anything.
Yeah.
So what does that look like day to day to walk in that?
Well, two things. I think in your neighborhood, rather than always looking for how can I serve my neighbors, you might look about how can my neighbors serve me, and ask them. Humble yourself and ask them, because that might be the way that you really form a relationship. That's the way the disciples did. The other thing is that it's interesting that the disciples, I'm trying to remember if this is the version, but anyway, Jesus takes what they bring, or a couple of fish and some loaves and stuff like that, and he multiplies them. So God will use what we bring, but he'll multiply the effect of it. We might say, that this couldn't do anything. So we got to bring something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
we are contributing something.
Exactly.
that we have.
And so don't minimize what you contribute, but do your best with what little you have, but trust that God will multiply its effect. That would be another way. I think I was thinking, I was reading David and Goliath yesterday, and I never noticed before, but when Saul tries to give him all this armor and stuff like that, and to fight Goliath with, and it's just awkward, and he says, "I can't use this. I've never tested it." I thought, tested it, huh? Because he had killed a lion, he had killed a bear, he had some experience in fighting big things, depending on God, but he didn't have any experience using armor. And so rather than taking the armor, he just said, "I haven't tested it." And so when we've served God, you got to have a little experience you're relying on, that, okay, I've done this, I can do what I've done before and see and then see if God will multiply that. So those are just, I think that they brought what the little boy had, and Jesus multiplied that.
I love that story you were talking about, or what you were just saying, learning how to see how your neighbors can serve you. When I first moved into our latest house, I was installing a doorbell, and I was out there with my drill, and I was drilling into the mason or whatever it was, and it was just not having any luck, and it was making this really loud shrieking noise. And then my neighbor across the street, she says, "Sounds like you got a dull bit there." I was like, "Yeah." She goes, I might have something to help you. And then we went on to have like an incredible spiritual conversation. It just opened up, and it was really cool. And as opposed to kind of feeling, no, I've got this. I let the person help me, and it was a great conversation. So,
yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, I think a way I try to think about this is just what's a little risk I can take today that to risk failure in some ways.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes it's just a person that I walk by every morning with Nate, saying hi, and waving, and sometimes it's stopping to see if they'll talk a little bit, just say, hey, how's your day going, or something like that. It's just little things. It's when I go into the grocery store and I know the people there, just stopping and saying, committing myself to, I'm going to stop a little bit longer and ask them a question.
That's good.
And here's what I'm going to ask them. And so, you have to take baby steps in these things to be dependent. It doesn't, we're not talking about attempting huge things for God. You got to be willing to attempt little things.
Yeah, yeah, and get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yes,
I mean that's a lot, because you can't make a big step of discomfort if you haven't been taking any small steps toward discomfort.
Yeah, good.
That's good.
Good thoughts, fellas. Thank you. I think that's a good place to land the plane, to wrap it up. Insert whatever ever metaphor for concluding something you want to here.
Let's crash the plane.
Good time to crash the plane. Good time to poison the raccoons.
Yeah.
And
ooh, good idea.
No, I jest. I don't, but anyway,
I kid the raccoons.
I kid. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, listeners. We'll be back to talk with you again soon.